Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you on this Tag Thursday. It's a tag called the Get to Know the Sci-Fi Reader tag. I saw it on Rajathon's channel, which I'll link to down below, a fantastic channel. He didn't tag me because he hates me because I smell. And I also saw this channel just even later than that on Shawn D Standfast channel. And he also did not tag me because he also hates me because he's also partaken of the rumor going around that I smell. But in light of Shawn's channel, I want to start my own version of this tag with a disclaimer and a disagreement. The disclaimer, of course, is that in this little corner booktube that we have somehow managed to create, disagreeing with someone is fun. It does not mean tribal warfare. It does not mean genocide. We are not blue-haired, blue checkmarked fascists on Twitter who absolutely frothing at the mouth, eyes up in the head, demand that everyone agree with them. It is entirely possible to disagree with someone about bookish things and stay their friend. I have done it many times with Britta, with Olive, with Jason Harrigan. I've done it. I've disagreed and stayed friends with Mark Richardson on camera for your entertainment many times. And the reason I say this is because when it comes to Shawn's version of this tag, we hit a disagreement right away. And it's a disagreement about nomenclature. And it's a disagreement that, as far as I can tell from Shawn's own channel, I have had face-to-face with some writers that he likes. And that is the disagreement about what to call this tag. It's called the Get to Know the Sci-Fi Reader tag, and Shawn doesn't like that right out of the gate. And he objects on the grounds that many science fiction fans have objected to over the decades, which is the term sci-fi, which is derogatory. It is usually used as a means of dismissal by people who don't read science fiction, to lump it as lowbrow, shoot 'em up, lasers and bug-eyed monsters garbage, without any literary quality. And amazingly, the ignorant condescension of people who don't know what they're talking about has actually filtered in to the science fiction community. That shouldn't be true. The objection that I have to this whole argument of nomenclature, what to actually call this genre, boils down to morality. That's not too highfalutin. It boils down to morality, which is that it is wrong to respond to condescension by turning around and condescending. That is wrong to do. Two wrongs don't make a right. Science fiction is the despised stepchild of genres. It always has been. It is viewed as bug-eyed monsters and laser beams. It is viewed with withering contempt even by the so-called literary parvenus and carpetbaggers who tramp in, write a wretched book like The Road, and then tramp back out again to their precious literary fiction precincts. If you were to call Cormac McCarthy a science fiction writer, he would sue you. Same thing if you were to get up in front of an audience at a literary festival in Adelaide or wherever and call Margaret Atwood a science fiction writer. The audience would howl. They would view it as an insult, even though she's written books that technically try, at least, to be science fiction. I have always hated this nomenclature disagreement, mainly because we're talking about a difference in quality, not a difference in kind. Buck Rogers' adventures are only badly written. That's all. But they are no less science fiction. Sci-fi applies to everything. They are no less schlocky in terms of the science than the most revered hard science fiction that exists in the canon. I think when you get the ranks of genre aficionados themselves to start turning on each other and saying, well, I like science fiction, but I don't like sci-fi, then you have won. Then the people who are condescending to the whole genre have won if they get you to do that. So I'm going to stick with sci-fi. I have no problem with that whatsoever. If someone wants to condescend to the genre of science fiction, to me, and say, oh, bug-eyed aliens and laser beams, well, then I have very easy responses to them. I can either say, yeah, bug-eyed aliens and laser beams, love it, absolutely love it. Or if they dig their heels in and say, oh, so you mustn't be that much of a serious reader if you're satisfied with that kind of stuff. Well, that's another conversation, isn't it? And I am perfectly happy to have that conversation. You won't fare well if you try that, but people have. So I'm going to start off my tag by disagreeing with Shawn D. Standfast that it matters whether we correct people to say science fiction or speculative fiction or SF as opposed to sci-fi. That only matters if we want to kowtow a little to the very readers who condemn us. Well, I'm not willing to do that. So I don't think Shawn keeps referring to it in his video as pedantry. I don't think it's that. But I do think that it is a what's the odious business world phrase? It's not the hill to die on. so I'm going to just call it the get to know the sci-fi reader tag, and it starts off as all of these get to know tags do with an origin story. What is your sci-fi origin story? How did you come to read your first science fiction novel? And the second part of that question is in parentheses. I think probably because the person who did this tag was originated by BookswithEmilyFox, and she may have realized when she was doing that question that for a lot of people, their science fiction origin story is not literary. And certainly that was true for me. That was absolutely true for me. I do have a science fiction origin story when it comes to books, but I was surrounded by science fiction of other types in addition to books, like, for instance, TV, right? Where my introduction to science fiction was the adventures of Superman. Yes, Superman, a strange visitor from another planet, came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Superman could bend steel in his bare hands, change the course of mighty rivers, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. I was introduced to science fiction as well and truly by the adventures of Superman as I was by anything else. Same thing later on with Star Trek. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. And then after that, by Doctor Who, the fourth Doctor, Tom Baker. So there's a rich introduction to science fiction there that has nothing to do with books. And the same thing with comic books. Comic books are entirely based on science fiction. They're the ugly stepchildren of science fiction. And my favorite comic book was Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, which specifically got its mileage out of the dramatic friction between the normal and the futuristic, the fantastic, because Superboy is living and growing up in normal mid-20th century Midwest. Buckboard trucks, traffic meters, doctors who make house calls, local dams, that sort of thing. And yet, when he travels 1,000 years in the future to the home of the Legion of Superheroes, there are robot servitors, there are flying cars and flying buses, there are monsters and aliens everywhere. I learned a lot about science fiction from the Legion of Superheroes. I'm not ashamed to admit it at all. But there were books. And for me, the absolute DNA formative books were the Barsoom novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I already knew the Tarzan novels, but as much as I love the Tarzan novels, and even a little bit of Carson of Venus, it was John Carter that did it for me. It was the Barsoom novels that did it for me. Because Edgar Rice Burroughs' idea, his conception of Barsoom, is so wonderfully exotic. It has Arabian Nights style adventure, but it is undergirded everywhere by science fiction. The people of Barsoom have air cars, and Edgar Rice Burroughs explains how they work. They have radium pistols, and he explains how they work. There's lots of fantasy elements involved, what I would call fantasy elements. That's another disagreement that Shawn and I might have, because, and certainly he wouldn't be alone in disagreeing with me. I have always maintained that there is the barest fig leaf of difference between science fiction and fantasy. They're basically the same genre. As I always say, it doesn't really matter to me whether you get your characters from a planet in one solar system to a planet in another solar system in the course of one afternoon through what you call a faster-than-light drive or through an incantation by Gandalf. They're basically the same. Neither one happens in the real world, and you can't justify that either one ever could happen. So, but we won't open that can of worms. It started for me with Barsoom, with this weird world that is a combination of anachronistic, because these are people, they sleep under skins, they wear very little clothing, they fight with weapons, with cutlasses and whatnot, and science fiction. there are atmosphere plants. There are ray guns. There are air cars. There are with buoyancy bladders and whatnot. So it started with those, but then it moved on in two different directions, because this gets back to what I mentioned about SF and sci-fi, because I quickly learned, branching out from the Barsoom novels, that science fiction could be dreadful. And the book I have in mind is Have Spacesuit Will Travel by Robert Heinlein, which I read knowing nothing, a wet behind the ears newt, and I read it, and one of my first formulated thoughts about it was, this isn't very good, is it? But right about the same time, I read A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller, and had a radically different reaction. My reaction to that was, this is as good as the last 5 so-called mainstream, so-called literary novels that I've read. This is every bit as good as them. So when I branched out, I encountered the difference between sci-fi and science fiction. If you want to use such nomenclature, I think that's what it mainly applies to. Not the use of tired old gimmicky things like mind swaps or alien golems or whatever, but the way you do it, the quality of the literature involved, the quality of your skill as a writer. I think you could still hear in the background that manic dog. I don't know if you can hear him. He's made a guest appearance, an audio guest appearance in the many videos of mine by now. He originally concerned me because he barks a lot. And so I went over and face mooched with him and talked to him. If you have a dog barking nonstop on a porch or in a yard, in your backyard, do not expect me to get in touch with animal control or the police or you, God help us, before I walk right onto your property. This is a living thing. It's not a malfunctioning toaster. I'm not going to ask permission to walk right onto your property and ask that person what the story is. And if you don't like that, well, too bad. You're the one who has someone barking their head off all day long. If it was a baby crying all day long on your back porch and somebody walked up to find out what was going on, you wouldn't say, hey, you shouldn't be on my property. Or if you would, you'd be hauled away. But the long and the short of it is, I went over there. I think we can still hear him. I went over there weeks ago to get the skinny. There he is. And he's perfectly happy. Just likes to bark at things. Barks at squirrels, barks at birds. Just likes to bark at things. But he's perfectly happy. He had only positive things to say about his humans. So just in case you're wondering whether or not I'm ignoring a problem. I'm not. I went over and investigated. Of course I did. And there is no problem. Just the noise. I imagine some of their neighbors, their human neighbors, might object to the noise, but he only does it during the day. So I don't imagine he's bothering many people. But anyway, let's move on, shall we? Question number 2. 12 minutes. And we're at question number 2. If you could be the hero or heroine of a sci-fi novel, who would be the author, and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? And for the 8 millionth time, when it comes to tags of any kind on BookTube, I do not want to be a character in a novel. Okay? I don't want to be a character in a novel. I'm not going to digress here into the misuse of the word trope that is so endemic on BookTube. I'm simply going to say I don't want to be a character in a novel. These kinds of questions I am simply always going to skip over. So we'll go straight on to question number 3. What is a sci-fi you've read this year that you want more people to read? I object a little to the formulation of the question because I don't want more people to read it. I mean, both of these have found an audience, so they don't need any more readers. But I don't want more people to read it unless they want to. You know, but in terms of books that I have read this year, I'm interpreting the question to mean sci-fi books that I've read this year that I liked. And 2 came to mind. One, and again, we are on the split between SF and sci-fi, because one is The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which I thought was very, very good. Moving, and also very, very smart, very thoughtful. But the other is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, the author of the Aragon books. And it's not as well written as the Tchaikovsky book, but it's absolutely bursting with inventiveness. So much creativity went into this thing. Just so much did. Lavish amounts of it. I've actually been thinking about that book a lot since I read it and reviewed it. It's been on my mind a lot. The world, the characters, I really appreciate it. I was worried, of course. I mean, this author became a squintillionaire when he was 18 for a series of fantasy novels that are quite bad. They are quite bad. They are horribly written. and also massively derivative dragon riders. I worried that you reach the age of 20 and you're that way, and you're suddenly a grand old man of letters, and all of your relatives and friends from high school are now your employees, and they know what their job is, and their job is to affirm you. That picture, I'm not saying that is his reality, but that picture haunted me, and I thought, okay, well, then this is a monster that we have all helped to create and then launched into the literary world. So all of his subsequent books, if he writes them, are going to be monstrously pompous and entitled. And To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is not at all. It is working hard to earn its readership. That was the last thing in the world I expected, and it's so enjoyable that I've been thinking about it a lot. Question number 4 is, what is your favorite sci-fi subgenre, and what subgenre have you not read much from? My favorite sci-fi subgenre is space opera, which would be a little bit hard to describe. The word sprawling always comes into the description. It's big, takes place on many planets, involves a large cast of characters, involves usually the rise and fall of governments or empires. It's not a first contact story usually, although it can encompass them. The thing I like about space opera is that it can fold in all the rest of science fiction. And it takes one of the signature characteristics of science fiction, which is world building, and just massively expands it, just pumps it full of steroids. I love that. I absolutely love that. But the second part of the question, I'm afraid I can't answer. What subgenre have you not read much from? Probably works with much younger people who answer this tag, but with older people who answer this tag, certainly with those of us who've wasted so much of our time reading bug-eyed monsters and laser beam stories, there is no subgenre of science fiction that I have not read extensively. there is no kind of science fiction that I have not read until the cows come home, so I can't answer that one. Question number 5 is, who is one of your auto-buy science fiction authors? And I bridled right away at buying. I don't particularly like to buy new books. Good Lord. Aren't they expensive? I prefer to get them from publishers. But in terms of authors that I immediately want to read, the first one is a short story author, Robert Reed, who is an auto-buy author because I buy my science fiction periodicals, which is where his short stories appear. As far as I know, I could be wrong about this, but as far as I know, he has never done a science fiction anthology of his stories. It'd be enormous. You'd be a whole library shelf of them by now. But his science fiction short stories, when they appear in Asimov's or Astounding, are always guaranteed to be great. But in terms of ongoing fiction, there's Martha Wells, the Murderbot series, big fan. There's Ted Chiang. Whatever he's doing in his science fiction short stories, I'm not 100% sure how to classify what he's doing, but whatever he's doing, it's tremendously good. Often tremendously good. Kim Stanley Robinson has a new book coming out. I never miss a book by this author. And also, in terms of space opera, James Corey. The Expanse novels conclude this year. And they are terrific. Just terrific. A terrific, intelligent, well thought out example of the kind of space opera that I was referring to. So, there are plenty of others, but those authors like that, I immediately want to read the book. Question number 6 is, how do you typically find sci-fi recommendations? Goodreads, YouTube, podcasts, Instagram, that sort of thing. And for me, I usually find out about them from book publicists. Those of you who are new to the channel, the reason that I'm going on this way is because I am a book reviewer. I'm a professional book reviewer. So I'm in contact with lots and lots of book publicists. I find out from them, often from authors. If I've given the author a fair shake or even a rough handling 10 years ago and they have a new book and it's science fiction, they will often let me know. Publishers, a couple of publishers are friends of mine. And also from the industry journals, the advanced industry journals like Publishers Weekly or Library Journal or Kirkus, that sort of thing, where they get advanced copies of books, and unlike everybody else, they don't wait until the pub date. They review it right away. And they do it in order to get initial word so that people whose job it is to order books ahead of time, like librarians or book section editors, can have a little bit of a heads up as to what kind of things are starting to generate responses. I'm not 100% sure that I'm completely comfortable with that setup, even though I am a part of it. But nevertheless, I find out from, usually what I mean is I get my early recommendations from industry sources rather than from places like Goodreads or YouTube or podcasts, who are always doing recommendations after the fact, after the book is out or after the book is right about to come out. I like to know, I usually find out well ahead of that. Question number 7 is, what is an upcoming sci-fi release you're excited for? This would be, once again, harking back to the nomenclature divide between science fiction and sci-fi. The thing that immediately popped to mind is definitely sci-fi. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that on this particular instance, Shawn could stand to lighten up a little. There's plenty of sci-fi that's tremendously fun, and it doesn't besmirch the rest of the genre. I assure you, the science, the hard science in, for instance, Larry Niven, is no better. It's no more legitimate than the hard science in Keith Laumer. Ray guns don't exist. Either way, faster than light travel doesn't exist. So, but the book I have in mind is Zombie Fallout number 15, Sifting Through the Ashes. This is by Mark Tufo. And it is the 15th installment in the ongoing zombie plague adventures of a character named Michael Talbot. Although by now the subcast, a secondary and tertiary characters, has exploded. These are self-published. They are they are marvelous. When it comes to zombie apocalypse, sci-fi, cheeseball stuff, they are the ultimate sweet spot. And the new one, Sifting Through the Ashes, is coming out, I think, in December. And I'm not. I mean, this guy makes a good living off his self-published books. These zombie Fallout books have taken off. But even so, he's not a publisher. He publishes them himself. So I buy them. I don't ask for an advance. I'm not such a ponce that I'm going to, especially since when it comes to self-published books, he doesn't need my help. His book, like so many well-received and extremely popular self-published books, especially books in series, are on a separate wavelength from critical appraisal. I'm sure he'd like it, but what possible difference could it make to him? Critical appraisal, one way or another, won't make a bit of difference to these things. So there isn't really a conversation on that level. Instead, it's just fans talking about what's happening in each book. But I would never miss one. And I strongly recommend them if you're in the mood for just the most wonderful, purely heartfelt zombie schlock that you'll ever get. It's just I strongly recommend it. Then question number 8 is, what's one misconception about sci-fi that you would like to lay to rest? This is one that is going to crop up in this Get to Know the Sci-Fi Reader tag quite a bit, and it is that you need to be a nerd. That you need a certain amount of greater than normal science literacy, or that you need to be a nerd in order to read science fiction at all, in order to get it at all. That is absolutely not true. This is storytelling. It's adventure storytelling. Really, its first cousin is not a science textbook, but rather Treasure Island. If you do not need to be science literate, you do not need to be a nerd to read these at all. Not at all. Not if the author's doing their job. If the author isn't doing their job, and believe you me, quite a few of them don't. I could name you some so-called hard science fiction authors that are expecting you to come to their work with a doctorate in physics. And when I read their work and realize, okay, all right, fine, I'm grappling along based on just my scientific American understanding of physics. But even so, nothing dramatic has happened in this story until page 100. Up until then, it's just been you flexing your muscles about how much you know about science. That's just a bad novel. That doesn't get a pass because it's science fiction. That's just bad. I have very little patience with such things, and neither should you. So the characterization, the stereotype of science fiction that you need to be able to understand those first 100 pages of pure physics before you get to someone stabbing someone else, that is false. A novel, any kind of novel that takes 100 pages to get off the ground, is a failure. looking at you, Marcel Proust. so don't let anybody tell you otherwise. No, a lot of times the mischaracterization of science fiction as nerds only is put forward by the nerds themselves. And as unlikely as this turn of phrase would ever be in their real lives, I say screw them. They don't anymore get to put up a keep out sign than you do. So dive right in. If you encounter a science fiction novel that isn't gelling as a work of drama, drop it. Not because you're not up on science, but because it's a bad novel. And then question number 9 is, if someone had never read a sci-fi before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that came to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? I wouldn't recommend the first 3 books that came to mind. I would instead carefully ask, forensically ask questions to the person. I take book recommendations very, very seriously. I don't just blurt out titles. I would want to know what, if you've never read science fiction before, but you are a reader, then what do you like to read? What kinds of books do you like to read? What kinds of stories do you like to read? What kinds of characters do you like to follow? Because there's something for everybody in science fiction. If you like to read police procedurals, I can find you science fiction that will make an easy transition from that. If you like to read romance or horror or the hero's journey or things like that, I can find you science fiction that will be an easy transition from what you've read to the science fiction language, to the science fiction lingo and worldview. And one approach that I would strongly recommend, no matter what, is short stories instead of novels. Because we are talking about a lingo here. We're talking about a patois, and that takes time. It takes time, no matter what it is, no matter what the language is, it takes time to acclimate to it. So dumping somebody off in the middle of an Ursula Le Guin novel and expecting them to sink or swim for 300 pages is asking a little much. Better to give them a few short stories, if you can, or a really good science fiction anthology. And start them off that way. That way they'll not only get their feet underneath them, but they'll also get a sampling of all the different kinds of patois, all the different kinds of lingo that are out there in the science fiction world. But my answer to this wouldn't be the typical thing. A lot of people might hear this and think, oh, well, you got to recommend Dune. No, I don't have to recommend Dune. Not at all. It's an extremely complex and multi-layered novel that's also heavily reliant on the science that is its backdrop. Giving that to somebody who's never read any science fiction before is a recipe for disaster. It might work, but it's more likely not going to. So no, I would want to ask you lots of questions before I recommend something. And question number 10 is, who is the most recent sci-fi reading content creator that you came across that you'd like to shout out? And I actually came across this content creator, this booktuber, because of Rajathon, because she tagged him. She didn't tag me, I assume, because somehow she has caught on to the rumor that I smell. But it's Angela from Literature Science Alliance. I'll leave a link to her channel down below. Tremendous fun to watch. So I'll leave a link to these down, all of the channels that I've mentioned in down below. I don't actually know who to tag on this because these get to know the fill-in-the-blank reader tags have been making the rounds. As far as I know, Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads and Jason Harrigan of Bywis and Bookland have not done this tag. I don't think they have. I would love to hear their answers. To the very limited extent that their answers would be any different from mine. Certainly when Mark is concerned, we overlap a lot. We diverge after science fiction, but we overlap a lot on science fiction. But I'd love to hear the answers to these, and also the answers from anybody else who's watching this who has the science fiction bent. This is just terrific to do, to flesh these things out like this. So that was the Get to Know the Sci-Fi Reader tag, or the SF Reader tag if we're trying to placate Shawn D. Standfast. And I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.